the deleted verse of Revelation that explains the true reason for the rapture. There is a verse that most Christians have never read, not because it was removed from the Bible, but because no one stopped to look at what it actually says. It is in Revelation. It is in plain sight. And when you understand what it means, the doctrine of the rapture will never look the same again. This text was not erased with ink. It was erased with silence, the book that scared the world to understand what this verse hides. You must first understand where it is, and understanding where it is requires you to enter one of the most misunderstood texts in all the history of human literature. We are not just talking about religious literature. We are talking about literature in general. In 2,000 years of existence, few texts have produced as much fascination, as much fear, as much confusion, and as much hope as the book of Revelation. The Apostle John was in exile. He was over 80 years old, if historical dates are correct, and had been banished to an island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos. The island was just over 13 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide, smaller than many modern city neighborhoods. It was a place of forced isolation, a kind of open-air prison used by the Roman Empire to condemn those who represented some political or religious threat. John had been sent there by Emperor Domitian, who ruled Rome from 81 to 96 Anno Domini, and who became known for actively persecuting Christians, demanding to be called Lord and God, Dominus et Deus, in a direct provocation that any follower of Jesus would be unable to accept. It was in this context, exile, isolation, persecution, that the visions arrived. The date most accepted by scholars for the composition of Revelation is around 95 or 96 Anno Domini. This places John as a very elderly man, the last of the original apostles still alive. Peter had been crucified upside down in Rome. Paul had been beheaded. James had been killed with the sword. Of all the 12 who walked beside Jesus along the roads of Galilee, John was the last, and it was precisely at this moment, when the original human testimony was coming to an end, that the most complete revelation about the end times arrived. The book has 22 chapters and 404 verses. For a book the size of Revelation, this is a relatively small number. The entire Bible has more than 31,000 verses. Revelation represents little more than 1% of that total. And yet, it is the text that dominates the Christian imagination when the subject is the end times in a way disproportionate to any other book of the Scriptures. Why? Because Revelation does not just speak of what will happen, it speaks of how it will end. And human beings have a profound need to know how stories end, especially the story they are living. But before we reach the verse that remained in the shadows, you need to understand the structure of the book, because it is in this structure that the silence occurs. Revelation begins with 7 letters addressed to 7 churches in Asia Minor, 7 real communities with real problems, with real people who are trying to follow Christ amidst imperial repression: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. 7 cities, 7 messages, each with a diagnosis, a warning, and a specific promise. The risen Christ presents himself in a different way to each community, as the one who holds 7 stars, as the Son of Man who has eyes like a flame of fire, as the one who has the sharp two-edged sword, and each presentation is calibrated to what that specific community needs to hear. And it is exactly here, in these 7 letters, in the first pages of the most prophetic book of the Bible, before the horsemen and the dragons and the numbers, that the forgotten verse is waiting. What happens after chapter 3? Most people who read Revelation skip the first 3 chapters. It is a documented phenomenon among scholars of biblical reading. Pastors who preach series on the book generally jump from the initial greetings straight to chapter 4, which begins with an absolutely breathtaking scene of heavenly worship. A throne surrounded by 24 elders dressed in white, 4 living creatures covered with eyes all over, crystal and emerald and rainbows and lightning, and then they move on to the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, the great events, the horsemen of the apocalypse, the 144,000, the woman and the dragon, the cinematic material. The material that makes 45-minute sermons seem short. The letters to the 7 churches are left in the background. It is understandable. The letters are pastoral texts that speak of specific problems of specific communities from 2,000 years ago. They are harder to make spectacular. They are less dramatic than the four horsemen of chapter 6. But here is the problem. Here is the core of everything we will explore in the coming pages. When you ignore the 7 letters, you ignore the theological foundation upon which all the rest of Revelation was built. And when you ignore this foundation, you are left without an answer to the most important question any Christian can ask about the end times. Not the question, when will it happen? Not the question, who is the Antichrist? Not the question, what are the seals, or who are the 144,000? The most important question, the question the forgotten verse answers, is this: why would God take his own out of a world that still needs them? This question is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable because the standard answer, circulating in churches, on religious television programs, and in prayer groups, fails to answer it satisfactorily. The standard answer says that the rapture exists to spare Christians from the suffering of the Great Tribulation, to deliver the faithful from the period of judgment that will fall upon the earth. It is an answer that sounds reasonable. It is an answer that warms the heart. But it is an answer that has a serious problem when you place it alongside the rest of the Bible. The God of the Bible is not a God who protects his own by sparing them from suffering. The 3 Hebrew youths were not spared from the furnace. They were thrown into the furnace and protected within it. Daniel was not spared from the lion's den. He was thrown into the den and survived. Joseph was not spared from slavery and prison. He went through both and emerged as governor of all Egypt. Paul was not spared from shipwrecks, stonings, lashings, and imprisonments. He lived through it all and still wrote half of the New Testament. Martha and Mary lost their brother before Jesus arrived. The churches of Smyrna and Philadelphia were being persecuted while they received the letters of Revelation. The biblical narrative, from Genesis to Jude, is consistent. God accompanies his own in tribulation. He does not remove them from it. So what makes Revelation different? What justifies the total removal of Christians before the period of final tribulation? And why would this be promised in a verse that almost no one discusses in depth? It is here that the silence begins to make noise. The letter that no one preaches, the 6th letter of Revelation, is addressed to the church in Philadelphia. In Greek, Philadelphia means brotherly love, philos and friend, and adelphos, brother. It was a relatively small city by the Roman standards of the time, founded around 150 before Christ by the Pergamene king Attalus II, who named it in honor of the love he had for his older brother, Eumenes II. The city was located in the Cogamus River Valley, in a region of intense volcanic and seismic activity, known in antiquity as Katakekaumein, the burnt land, because the surrounding soil still carried the marks of volcanic eruptions from previous eras. The inhabitants of Philadelphia knew what it was to live in anticipation of disaster. The Greco-Roman historian Strabo, writing in the 1st century before Christ, described the region as an area of earthquakes so frequent that the walls of the houses were always cracked, and there was always someone working to repair some damaged structure. A particularly devastating earthquake in 12 Anno Domini, less than 100 years before John wrote Revelation, destroyed Philadelphia almost completely, and was so severe that Emperor Tiberius had to send financial aid for reconstruction. The inhabitants of the city were so traumatized by the subsequent tremors that many of them had the habit of sleeping outside the city walls, in improvised camps in the surrounding fields, to be able to run when the earth began to shake. They knew in their own skin what it meant to exist in a world that at any moment could move beneath their feet. It is not by accident that the most powerful promise of the entire sequence of the 7 letters was addressed exactly to this community. The text is in Revelation, chapter 3, verse 10, and it says the following, and pay attention to every word, because it is exactly here that 2,000 years of interpretation concentrate and diverge. Because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I also will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world, to try them that dwell upon the earth. 26 words in Portuguese. In Greek, the original has even fewer, but these 26 words carry the weight of one of the greatest theological controversies of the last 200 years. Can you measure what is written there? It is not a promise of protection during suffering. It is not a promise of strength to cross the tribulation. The promise uses a specific, deliberate expression, which in Greek is constructed with two terms that we need to examine together: tereo and ek. Two terms that, together, do not mean to keep within. They mean to keep out of, to keep away from, to keep by removing from the situation completely. This changes everything. Two words that divide Christianity. In Greek, there are two distinct ways to describe divine protection against adversity. The first is tereo en, to keep within, to protect in the midst of, to be with someone while the storm passes. It is the promise Jesus makes in Gethsemane. In John chapter 17, verse 15, "I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil, tereo ectu poneru, to keep from the evil one, but remaining in the world." It is the pattern of the three youths in the furnace. It is the pattern of Daniel in the lion's den, protection within the adverse situation, not removal from it. The second form is tereo eka, to keep out of, to remove before, to not allow the danger to reach. It is a protection that operates by eliminating exposure, not by sustaining the exposed. John could have used either of the two in Revelation 3 verse 10. He chose the second. This is not accidental. John was a writer of impressive precision. He was a man who had spent decades meditating on the words of Jesus, who had written not only Revelation, but also the Gospel of John and 3 epistles, texts that demonstrate extraordinary linguistic care, with elaborate chiastic structures, intentional parallels, and numerical symbolisms that scholars are still mapping. When John uses tereo eka, he is making a deliberate choice. He is saying that the protection promised to the church in Philadelphia, and by extension, to the community of believers that fits the characteristics described in this letter, is not protection within the hour of temptation. It is removal before it. To understand the weight of this, you need to understand what John calls the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world. He is not talking about a local tribulation. He is not talking about a regional persecution like that of Domitian, which affected some provinces in the east, but not the entire empire. He says explicitly, upon all the world, to try them that dwell upon the earth. It is an expression of universal scope. The phrase, them that dwell upon the earth, in Greek, tous katoikuntas epitesges, is used in Revelation in a technical way to describe the inhabitants of the earth who are on the opposite side of God, the group that supports the beast and receives the mark. It is the same expression used in chapter 6, verse 10, in chapter 8, verse 13, in chapter 13, verses 8 and 12. In each case, it is an expression of judgment, not of spiritual education. What is being promised, therefore, is not comfort to cross the judgment. It is departure before the judgment arrives. And here is the question that must be asked. If this promise has existed since the end of the 1st century, inscribed in the very text of Revelation with a grammatical precision that in Greek is unequivocal, why has it remained on the margins of discussions for so long? Why have most Christians who have attended churches for decades never heard a specific sermon on Revelation 3, verse 10, as a central interpretive key for the rapture? The answer lies in how the doctrine of the rapture was constructed and reconstructed throughout history, when the canonicity of Revelation was at risk. Here is a detail that most Christians holding the book of Revelation in their hands never consider. For nearly 300 years after its composition, the inclusion of Revelation in the canon of Scripture was disputed by a significant part of early Christianity. It was not clear to many church leaders of the 2nd and 3rd centuries that Revelation should be treated as authoritative scripture. Eusebius of Caesarea, the great historian of the early church who lived between 263 and 340 Anno Domini, records the ambiguity. There were those who accepted Revelation as authentic, and there were those who rejected it. Dionysius of Alexandria, in the 3rd century, argued that Revelation could not have been written by the same John who wrote the Gospel. The differences in Greek style were too great to be from the same author. The Syriac Church, which represented one of the great traditions of Eastern Christianity, excluded Revelation from its canon for centuries. The Synod of Laodicea, held around 363 Anno Domini, did not include Revelation in its list of recognized books. It was only with the councils of the late 4th and early 5th centuries, especially with the influence of Athanasius of Alexandria, who in 367 listed Revelation among the 27 books of the New Testament canon, and with the subsequent confirmation of the councils of Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397, that the book was recognized almost universally in the West. Why does this matter for our verse? Because a book whose canonical status was disputed for centuries naturally generated more cautious readings. Theologians who accepted Revelation as scripture still tended to interpret it allegorically or symbolically, not as literal prophecy of future events, but as a coded description of the spiritual battle already underway. Origen, Augustine, John Chrysostom, giants of early and medieval Christian thought, read Revelation mostly allegorically. This means that Revelation 3, verse 10, was read as a promise of general spiritual protection, not as the description of a specific event yet to happen. The verse remained in silence, not because it was ignored, but because for more than 1,500 years, the dominant interpretive structure did not allow it to be read as a literal prophetic promise. This changed in the 19th century, the man who reinvented the end of the world. You have probably never heard of John Nelson Darby, and that is exactly the problem. Darby was born in 1808 in London, the son of a prosperous Irish merchant. He studied law at Trinity College, Dublin, graduated in 1818, and had a promising legal career ahead of him. But a year after graduating, Darby abandoned law and was ordained a deacon of the Anglican Church in Ireland. He was 21 years old. 2 years later, he became an Anglican priest. He was a young man of exceptional intelligence, with a natural gift for languages. He read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, and German with ease, and a capacity for textual analysis that impressed his contemporaries. Darby's problem with the Anglican Church began when he realized that the institution was more concerned with politics and the maintenance of ecclesiastical power than with the questions the Bible actually posed. The final straw was when the British government interfered in the appointment of Irish bishops in 1827. For Darby, that was proof that the state church had become unreformable. He resigned from the Anglican priesthood and began meeting informally with other discontented Christians in private homes in Dublin, the embryo of what would later be known as the Plymouth Brethren, or simply the Brethren. In 1828, Darby suffered a horse-riding accident that left him with a fractured leg and forced him into immobility for months. And it was during this forced convalescence, spending weeks and weeks alone with the Bible open, that he reached a conclusion that would shake Protestantism forever. Darby read Isaiah, chapter 32, and he saw there, in the description of an era of peace and prosperity for Israel, a clue that previous theologians had systematically ignored. God had not finished with Israel. The Jewish people had a prophetic future distinct from the future of the church. And if this was true, if God's plan for Israel was separate from God's plan for the church, then it was possible that the two groups had different eschatological destinies. It was possible that the church would be removed before the prophetic events related to Israel in the end times. This intuition would become the embryo of what the world knows today as dispensationalism, the theological system that divides history into distinct periods called dispensations, and which sustains the doctrine of the pre-tribulation rapture as its best-known pillar. But here is the detail that most presentations on Darby omit. In 1830, a young Scottish girl named Margaret MacDonald, 15 or 16 years old, had what she described as a prophetic vision in which she saw two groups of Christians, some who would be taken before the period of tribulation and others who would go through it. Margaret's vision circulated in evangelical Christian circles in Scotland and England. Darby visited the MacDonald home in Port Glasgow in June 1830, only months after the vision had occurred. Whether Margaret's vision directly influenced his thinking, or whether the conclusions were reached independently, is a debate that historians and theologians have not yet resolved with unanimity. Historian Dave McPherson argued extensively for direct influence, while scholars like Grant Jeffrey and Thomas Ice contested this reading. But what is not in debate is this: In 1833, Darby publicly presented for the first time a coherent theological structure for the pre-tribulation rapture, and he used, among other texts, exactly the verse we are examining, Revelation 3, verse 10. Darby saw in that tereo ek, to keep out of, the explicit promise that the church would be removed before the period of tribulation, that the keeping from the hour of temptation was not a metaphor for divine protection in the midst of suffering, but literally a promise that those who belonged to the faithful church would not be present when that hour arrived, that the church would be raptured. It took 3 decades for this interpretation to cross the Atlantic, the crossing that changed American Protestantism. Darby visited North America 6 times between 1862 and 1877. These were long and exhausting journeys. Each crossing of the Atlantic by steamship lasted between 12 and 18 days, depending on the weather and sea conditions. But Darby was a man of unusual conviction. He preached in more than 250 churches in cities ranging from Chicago to St. Louis, from Boston to Detroit, from Toronto to San Francisco. His methodology was that of a careful strategist. He did not try to convince the congregations directly. He convinced the pastors and the leaders, and the pastors convinced the congregations. The impact was profound and lasting. Dwight L. Moody was one of the leaders influenced by Darby. Moody was the most famous evangelist in America in the second half of the 19th century, a man of nearly 130 kilograms, a thunderous voice, a handshake capable of breaking fingers, but with a capacity to communicate the gospel in a simple and direct way that filled arenas and theaters wherever he went. In 1886, a year after Darby's last visit, and 2 years after Darby died in Germany at 72 years of age, Moody opened the Chicago Bible Institute, which would later bear his name. The institute adopted Darby's dispensationalism as its central theological structure, and trained generations of pastors, missionaries, and teachers. These pastors went to hundreds of churches in every American state, and each of them took with them the dispensationalist structure, the division of history into periods, the distinct future of Israel, and the promise of the pre-tribulation rapture founded, among other texts, on Revelation 3 verse 10. Dispensationalism did not spread as an academic current running through universities and seminaries. It spread as a faith, as an emotional certainty, as a hope that ordinary people could carry in their hearts without needing a degree in theology to understand. The idea that God will take his own before the worst, before the Antichrist, before the mark of the beast, before the judgments of the 7 bowls, is an idea with immense and lasting emotive power. It is the idea that you matter enough for God to interrupt the course of history to protect you. But what if the true reason for the rapture was not to deliver Christians from suffering, but to complete something that still needs to be completed so that history can have its end? This question begins to open a layer that standard dispensationalism rarely explored in depth, and it begins exactly at the verse that remained in silence. The Bible that turned Protestantism upside down in 1899. A converted American lawyer named Cyrus Ingerson Schofield began working on a project that would forever transform the relationship of American Protestant Christians with biblical prophecy. Schofield was a man of complicated personal history. He had abandoned his first family, was accused of forging checks, had problems with alcohol before his conversion, but after becoming a Christian, he channeled all the legal intelligence and analytical capacity he had into the study of the Scriptures. Schofield was producing a Bible with extensive footnotes, marginal comments that explained the texts in light of Darby's dispensationalist system, but in a language accessible to the common believer, without the academic technicalities that made Darby's writings difficult for the average reader. It took 11 years of intense work. In 1909, Oxford University Press published the Schofield Reference Bible. In the first year of publication, 250,000 copies were sold. In 10 years, more than 2 million copies circulated in American churches. 2 million copies. To measure what this means, in 1910, the total population of the United States was just under 92 million people. Schofield's Bible reached 1 in every 46 Americans in the space of a single decade. And it did not arrive as an academic commentary that would stay on the shelves of seminaries. It arrived as a Bible for personal use, for domestic worship, for study in prayer groups. Schofield's notes were printed on the same page as the sacred text, in many editions right below the verse commented upon. For readers less attentive to the distinction between canonical text and editorial commentary, it was difficult to perceive where the Word of God ended and where Schofield's interpretations began. And in every relevant note on Revelation, the verse of Revelation 3, verse 10 was referenced. It was present as confirmation of the rapture, as one of the textual pillars that sustained the pre-tribulationist view. But it was present in a specific way, as proof that the church would be removed. The question of why, of the deep motive, the theological purpose, the spiritual meaning of this removal remained in the background. The emphasis was on the when and the how. The why remained in silence, and the silence, as we know now, grew thicker as the century advanced. When the silence grew louder, Darby's dispensationalism, filtered through Schofield's Bible and amplified by the Moody Institute, found its next great vehicle in a cultural phenomenon that no 19th-century theologian could have predicted: religious television and popular Christian literature from the 60s onward. In 1970, a man named Hal Lindsey published a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. The book translated 19th-century dispensationalist concepts into the language of the Cold War, connecting the events of Revelation with the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, and with the proliferation of nuclear weapons. In terms of cultural impact, the book was an unprecedented phenomenon in American religious literature. It sold more than 28 million copies in the first decades and was considered for several years the best-selling non-fiction book in America. But the true cultural peak of the doctrine of the rapture in popular culture came with the Left Behind series, written by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, starting in 1995. The series narrates in detail what happens in the days, weeks, and years following the rapture: those who went, those who stayed, the rise of the Antichrist, the organization of Christian resistance during the tribulation. In 16 volumes published between 1995 and 2007, the series sold more than 65 million copies, was adapted into films and series, and generated children's material, devotionals, study guides, and prophetic maps. 65 million copies. To compare, the Harry Potter series, perhaps the greatest phenomenon of popular fiction of the same era, sold 500 million copies in its history. But Left Behind did this within a specific niche, the evangelical Christian publishing market, starting from a numerically smaller audience base. The rapture had become, literally, entertainment, a narrative, a fictional world that you could inhabit for 16 volumes. And when a doctrine becomes popular culture, something inevitable happens. It loses its edges. It loses its precision. The difficult questions are left out because popular culture has no patience for difficult questions. Popular culture wants answers, wants certainties, wants emotion, wants narrative. So the deepest question, why would God take his own out of a world that still needs them, did not enter the plot of Left Behind. It did not enter the television sermons. It did not enter Schofield's footnotes. The question remained there, in chapter 3 of Revelation, waiting for someone to have enough patience, hupomone, to sit with it. Philadelphia, the community that no one closes of the 7 letters of Revelation, only 2 receive unreserved praise from the risen Christ, Smyrna and Philadelphia. The other 5 have some kind of correction, some kind of warning. Ephesus abandoned its first love, despite all its doctrinal orthodoxy. Pergamum tolerated false doctrines and idolatrous practices within its community. Thyatira allowed a prophetess named Jezebel to lead the faithful astray into immorality and the eating of things sacrificed to idols. Sardis had a name of being alive, but was dead. It possessed a spiritual reputation that did not correspond to the inner reality. Laodicea was the most devastating, lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, rich, prosperous, self-satisfied, and completely oblivious to its own spiritual misery. But Smyrna and Philadelphia, no warnings, no corrections, only honest diagnosis and generous promise. The letter to Philadelphia begins in verse 7 of chapter 3. Christ presents himself to this church as the one who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, he who shuts and no one opens. It is an image taken from Isaiah, chapter 22, verse 22, where the key of David represented absolute authority over the royal palace and over who had access to the king's presence. Applied to the risen Christ, the image is of absolute authority over access to the kingdom, over who enters and who does not enter, over who passes and who does not pass, over doors that only he can open and that once opened cannot be closed by any force in the universe. And then, in verse 8, Christ says one of the most significant phrases in the entire book, "I know thy works, behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. For thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word away, and hast not denied my name." Little strength, kept the word, not denied the name. These three elements form the portrait of the community to which the promise of verse 10 is addressed. It is not a community of spiritual giants. It is not a community of brilliant theologians or charismatic leaders who moved crowds. It is a community that had little strength, that was probably small in number, without political influence, without significant financial resources, but which, nevertheless, kept the word and did not deny the name. Think of this image. A small community, without power, without prestige, probably being pressured by Roman persecution on one side and by the hostility of local Jewish synagogues on the other. Verse 9 explicitly mentions those which say they are Jews and are not, but do lie. "Behold, I will make them to come and worship before thy feet," suggesting an active tension between the Christian community of Philadelphia and the local Jewish community that was perhaps denouncing the Christians to the authorities. A community living on volcanic earth in a city of always cracked walls, in a region that had been devastated by an earthquake decades before and knew that another could arrive at any moment. And yet, it kept the word. It did not deny the name. It is to this community that the promise arrives. And here, before proceeding, it is necessary to ask the question that organizes everything. Do you realize that the promise of the rapture was not made to a spiritual elite, but to a community defined exactly by the combination of persistent weakness with constant faithfulness? This changes the way you think about who goes and who stays, and it changes, above all, the way you think about the why. What the hour of temptation really means, the expression hour of temptation, in Greek, hora tou perasmou, is one of the densest in Revelation. To understand what is being promised, you need to understand what is being avoided. The word hora here is not a 60-minute interval. In biblical Greek, hora can designate a period of time of indefinite duration, but marked by a specific quality. It is the hour of something, not the duration of something. John uses this same word in other places in Revelation to designate the moment of judgment upon Great Babylon. In chapter 18, so verse 10, "For in 1 hour is thy judgment come," and the moment when the 10 kings receive authority for 1 hour along with the beast in chapter 17 down verse 12. In each case, hora designates a qualified period, a time that has a specific nature, a defined quality, not just a measurable duration. And perasmos, the word translated as temptation or trial. In Greek, the same word serves both concepts, and the context determines the translation. In James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, perasmos are the trials that produce patience and spiritual maturity, the kind of suffering that God allows for growth, which the Christian should receive with joy because it produces something of value. But in other passages, the same term appears with a sense of a test that goes beyond what a human being can endure without divine intervention. The Lord's Prayer includes the request, "Lead us not into temptation, mi eisenenkes hemas eis perasmon," using exactly this word to designate something from which deliverance is requested, not something one asks to cross. When John writes, "hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world, to try them that dwell upon the earth," he is using both concepts together. It is a period of specific quality, divine judgment, that will cover the entire inhabited earth. And for this period, the promise is not patience to cross. The promise is removal before it arrives. To complete the understanding, it is necessary to note an additional element, the pronoun, them that dwell upon the earth, tous katoikountas epites ges. As we have already mentioned, this expression is used in Revelation in a technical sense. It does not describe just anyone living on the earth. It describes specifically the group that is in opposition to God in the period of tribulation, those who worship the beast, those who receive the mark, those who persecute the saints. The hour of temptation is an hour of testing and judgment upon exactly this group. The promise of Revelation 3, verse 10 is saying that the community of Philadelphia and its equivalents throughout the centuries will not be found in this group when that hour arrives. Not because it will be protected within it, because it will have already departed before. The purpose that remained in silence. Revelation is not just a book about what will happen to the earth, it is a book about what will happen to Israel. And to understand why the church needs to be removed before the tribulation, you need to understand what the theological purpose of these final 7 years is. The prophet Daniel, in chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, described 70 weeks of years, a period of 490 years, destined specifically for the people of Israel and the holy city of Jerusalem, for 6 declared purposes: to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. 69 weeks have already been fulfilled according to the chronology that goes from the command to restore and build Jerusalem, issued by Artaxerxes I around 445 before Christ, to the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. 1 week is missing, 7 years. The period that Revelation describes in detail in chapters 6 to 19. These 7 years are not, in their essence, about randomly punishing humanity. They are about completing a work that God began with Israel more than 4,000 years ago. They are about the national conversion of the Jewish people, the moment when, as Zechariah describes in chapter 12, verse 10, Israel will look upon him whom they have pierced, and shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son. The prophet Jeremiah, in chapter 30, verse 7, calls this period explicitly the time of Jacob's trouble, not for the church, not for the Gentiles in general, but specifically for Jacob, the name that represents Israel, but adds that he shall be saved out of it. If the church were still present during these 7 years, it would create a problem of theological clarity. The Holy Spirit operates through the church as the primary expression of God's presence in the world since Pentecost. With the church present, God's specific purposes for Israel, the confrontation, the trouble, the conversion, would be mixed with the purposes for the church. The plan would need separation to have clarity. The removal of the church is not a reward for behavior. It is a necessity of the structure of the plan. And here is the detail that Revelation 3 verse 10 reveals, with a precision that no other text in the New Testament matches in the same way. The promise is not made because the church is good enough to deserve the rapture. The promise is made because the church kept the word with little strength, because it was faithful within its limitations, within its weakness, within its smallness. And this faithfulness within weakness qualifies the community to participate in something that transcends its own history. Because the rapture, at the deepest level, is not about escaping. It is about completing the body and the bride. There is an image that the Apostle Paul developed in detail, and that Revelation assumes as a background without needing to explain it, the image of the church as the body of Christ, and the image of the church as the bride of Christ. 2 distinct images, 2 distinct relationships, 2 distinct roles in God's plan. As the body, the church is the instrument through which Christ acts in the world. Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 23, that the church is the body of him who fills all in all, plerumenu tapanta en passant. The church is not just an organization of people who like Jesus. It is the concrete expression of Christ in the world, hands, feet, voice, tangible presence. Where the church is, Christ is operating through it. When the church cares for the poor, Christ is caring for the poor. When the church announces the gospel, Christ is announcing the gospel. The role of the body is instrumental. It is missional. It is defined by action in the world. As the bride, the church has a destiny that goes beyond the present mission. John describes in Revelation chapter 21, verse 2, the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven as a bride adorned for her husband. Later, in verse 9, one of the angels calls John and says, "Come hither, I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife." And what John sees is the holy city, the New Jerusalem descending from heaven. The church does not exist only to serve, it exists to unite. The final destination is not the mission, it is the marriage. And between these two roles, between the body that serves and the bride that unites, there is a moment of transition, a moment when the role of instrument of mission ends and the role of bride at the banquet begins. This moment is the rapture. It is not flight, it is arrival. It is not removal from a danger. It is positioning for a celebration that has been scheduled since before the foundation of the world. And Revelation 3 or verse 10 phrase, when read in this context, is not saying that God will take his own because the world has become too dangerous. It is saying that God will keep his own from the hour of tribulation because the role of the church in that hour will have already been completed. The testimony will be closed. The mission will be fulfilled, and the bride will need to be positioned for the banquet that follows the fulfillment of all things in Israel and on the earth, the 144,000. But the world is not left without testimony during the tribulation. Here is the detail that closes the argument with impressive precision. Revelation, chapter 7, verses 1 to 8, describes 144,000 sealed people, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin, Judah, 12 tribes, 12,000 from each, 144,000 in total. They are Israelites. They are Jews. They are people whose prophetic calling is rooted in the identity that God established with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob 4,000 years ago. They are not the church. They were not present in the mission of the church throughout the nearly 2,000 years that separated Pentecost from the rapture. They emerge exactly at the moment the church leaves the stage. And what do? The sequence of chapter 7 suggests that the result of their ministry is a multitude so great that no man can number it, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands, worshipping before the throne. It is the greatest missionary movement in human history, compressed into 7 years. But they can only operate in this way because the stage was prepared. Because the previous chapter of history, the chapter of the church, the 2,000 years of mission, was completed. The removal of the church does not leave the world without God. It opens space for another dimension of God's plan to operate with a clarity that is only possible after the previous stage has been concluded. The church, by being kept from the hour of tribulation, is not abandoning the world. It is fulfilling the plan that was always greater than it could see from where it stood. Keep this, the human cost of a doctrine. There is a dimension that theological discussions about the rapture frequently ignore because it is outside the scope of exegesis, a dimension that does not live in biblical commentaries or prophecy conferences, a dimension that lives in faces. During the last 2 centuries, since Darby systematized the doctrine of the pre-tribulation rapture, tens of millions of Christians have lived their entire lives under the shadow of this teaching. They raised children within it. They made financial decisions influenced by it. They defined the future of the communities they pastored based on it. They changed long-term plans with the certainty that Jesus could return at any moment, which sometimes produced genuine holiness and urgency, and sometimes produced negligence, irresponsibility, and an inability to build with long-term vision. And many of these Christians carried, along with the hope of the rapture, an anxiety that no one spoke of openly. The anxiety of, what if I don't go? The anxiety of waking up one day and realizing that the others went and you stayed. The anxiety of not knowing if faith was good enough, if obedience was consistent enough, if repentance had been complete enough. An entire generation of believers who grew up with the silent fear of being the ones left behind while more spiritual neighbors ascended. This anxiety is understandable, and it originates in a misconception that the verse in Revelation 3 undoes with gentleness. The promise was not made to the strongest community. It was not made to the most numerous, the most influential, the one that had the best preachers or the largest social programs or the most elaborate worship songs. It was made to the one that had little strength and kept the word. The qualification for the promise is not high spiritual performance. It is faithfulness within weakness. Think of how many people, in the last 200 years, were afraid of not being good enough to go in the rapture, without ever having heard that the biblical criterion that verse 10 points to is exactly the opposite of what fear suggests. The qualification is not greatness. It is persistence. It is not eloquence. It is faithfulness. It is not conquest. It is not denying the name. Consider the weight of this. In congregations all over the world, in the favelas of Brazil, in the villages of sub-Saharan Africa, in the outskirts of Buenos Aires and Bogotá and Nairobi, there are people with little strength who keep the word the way they can, with the resources they have, without making noise, without having followers on social media, without ministries with logos and sponsors, who simply persevere, who do not deny the name when it would be easier, safer, more profitable to remain silent, who keep the word of Christ's hupomone in circumstances that make perseverance an act of daily heroism. These people are not the target of God's forgetfulness. They are the exact target of the promise of Revelation 3, verse 10. This verse was written for them, the perseverance that opens the door. There is a word in the letter to Philadelphia that most translations translate as patience, and which in Greek is hupomone. It is one of the richest words in the spiritual vocabulary of the New Testament. It does not simply mean to endure. It is not the passive resignation of one who waits for the worst to pass. In Greek, hupomone is a combination of hypo, under, and mono, to remain. It is the capacity to remain under pressure, to continue standing while the weight is upon you, to not move from the spot, even when everything pushes for you to yield, to give up, to go away. See how Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1 uses this same word. Let us run with patience, hupomone, the race that is set before us. It is not a sprint, it is a long-distance race, a marathon. What decides the result is not who started fastest, but who did not stop. Christ says to the church in Philadelphia, "Thou hast kept the word of my patience," my hupomone, the word that describes how Jesus himself lived on earth, under the pressure of everything that can pressure a human being, betrayal by a close friend, rejection by family, misunderstanding by disciples, false accusation by religious leaders, unimaginable physical suffering, abandonment in the darkest moment, and yet he remained, yet he fulfilled, yet he reached the end. It is finished. To keep the word of Christ's hupomone is to live one's entire life with the quality of permanence that Jesus demonstrated. It is to not yield when the pressure arrives. It is to not deny the name when denying would be easier, safer, more profitable. It is to remain in place while the weight is upon you. And it is exactly this lifestyle, not what you conquered, but how you persisted, that the promise of verse 10 recognizes. Entire weeks of pressure without yielding, months of little strength without giving up, years of keeping the word in silence, without an audience, without applause, and then the door that no man can shut. The connection with John, chapter 14. The Christ who speaks to Philadelphia in Revelation 3 is the same who spoke to the disciples in the upper room on the night before the crucifixion, recorded in John chapter 14. "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. I go to prepare a place, I will come again. I will receive you unto myself." This is the promise of the rapture before Paul used the word harpazo in Thessalonians. Before Darby systematized dispensationalism, before Schofield printed 2 million Bibles, before Hal Lindsey sold 28 million books on prophecy, before LaHaye and Jenkins wrote 65 million copies of the Left Behind series, Before all that, in Jesus' last conversation with his friends before dying, was the promise, I go, I prepare, I return, I take, and the way Jesus describes this return is deeply personal. Receive you unto myself. Prosemouten, not to a place, to myself. The destination of the rapture is not paradise as a geographical location. It is Christ as a relationship. It is that where I am, there ye may be also, which is the language not of mission, but of union. It is the language of marriage. The rapture is not a theological theory developed in the 19th century. It is a personal promise made by Jesus Christ on the eve of his death. And Revelation 3 verse 10 is the echo of that same promise, filtered through more than 60 years of the Apostle John's meditation, inscribed in a letter to a small community in a city that lived on volcanic earth, waiting for the tremor that one never knows when will arrive. The difference is that, this time, the tremor will carry his own home. What Paul saw and described before reaching Revelation, before John received the visions on Patmos, Paul had already described the rapture with unusual specificity. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, probably written around 51 Anno Domini, more than 40 years before Revelation, Paul uses language so concrete it seems almost technical. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. The word Paul uses for caught up is harpazo in Greek. In the Latin translation of the Bible, known as the Vulgate, produced by Jerome between 382 and 404 Anno Domini, harpazo was translated as rapiamur, from which comes the Latin raptus, from which comes rapturo, from which comes, in English, rapture, harpazo. The word that in Greek means to seize with force, to take suddenly, to remove in an abrupt and irresistible way. The same word that appears in Acts, chapter 8, verse 39, to describe how the Spirit of the Lord caught away Philip immediately after he baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. Philip was on a road, baptized a man in a spring of water, and then simply was no longer there. He appeared 40 kilometers away at Azotus. The same word used in 2 Corinthians, chapter 12, verse 2, when Paul describes the man who was caught up to the third heaven, an experience of immediate, irresistible transport beyond the boundaries of the natural. The harpazo of Thessalonians is the collective fulfillment of what happened individually with Philip, of what happened with Enoch in Genesis, of what happened with Elijah in 2 Kings. The rapture is not a new idea. It is the culmination of a pattern that the Bible has been building since the second human generation, Enoch, Elijah, and the pattern few. Perceive 2 men in the Bible did not die. 2 men were taken without going through the natural process of death. And this is not a narrative accident. It is a deliberate pattern inscribed at the 2 extremes of the Old Testament canon, at the beginning of the Pentateuch and at the end of the historical books. Enoch appears in Genesis, chapter 5, in a genealogical list that is normally skipped because it seems repetitive. So-and-so lived so many years and begat so-and-so, and then lived so many more years and died. It is a list of births and deaths, but with Enoch, the pattern breaks. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No death, no grave, no farewell. Only he was not. Enoch was 365 years old when he was taken, exactly the number of days in a full solar year, a coincidence that rabbis and church fathers noted for centuries without ever reaching a definitive consensus on what it means, but which is clearly intentional from the perspective of the sacred author. 365 years of walking with God, and then departure, without the interruption of death. Elijah is more dramatic. In 2 Kings, chapter 2, the prophet Elijah and his disciple Elisha are walking together through the Jordan Valley, when suddenly there appears a chariot of fire with horses of fire that separates them. And Elijah goes up by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha rends his own clothes in 2 pieces, the gesture of death without the body to bury. Elijah was taken in front of a witness, not in silence, like Enoch, but in a public, spectacular, irresistible demonstration. Two distinct patterns, a silent and individual removal, a demonstrative and public removal, one without a witness, one before a witness. The rapture will be different from both. It will combine the individual element, each believer taken, with the collective element, the entire church simultaneously. It will combine the relative silence of Enoch, life following normally until the moment one is simply no longer there, with the demonstration of Elijah, the audible signal of the trumpet, the voice of the archangel Charles, the dead in Christ rising first. And Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, in chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, announces that Elijah will return before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Christian tradition and Jewish tradition have dialogued for centuries about what this means, whether it is a reference to John the Baptist, who came in the spirit and power of Elijah preparing the way for the first advent of Christ, or whether it is a reference to a literal appearance of Elijah in a specific role in the pre-eschatological period. Revelation, in chapter 11, describes two witnesses who will prophesy for 1260 days, 3.5 years, before being killed by the Antichrist and then publicly resurrected before the city of Jerusalem. The identification of these two witnesses is debated, but many scholars associate them with Moses and Elijah based on specific characteristics: the power to shut heaven so that it does not rain, as Elijah did, the power to turn waters into blood, as Moses did in Egypt. The pattern closes upon itself. He who was taken without dying will return to die in public and resurrect in public. The inversion is complete. The narrative closes the circle. But what Enoch and Elijah reveal, before any eschatological interpretation, is that God has a history of removing people from the normal trajectory of death when the plan requires it. Not because they are perfect, not because they deserve an exception to natural rules, but because the plan has a precision that includes the destiny of specific individuals at specific moments. And the rapture, in this context, is not an exception to the rule. It is the rule operating at scale, the moment the text speaks. Let us return to the verse. Let us return to the text. Let us return to the 26 words that remained in silence for so long. Because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I also will keep thee from the hour of temptation, which shall come upon all the world, to try them that dwell upon the earth. Now read it again, but this time, read it paying attention to what comes before the promise, because thou hast kept. The promise is linked to something prior. It is a response. It is a reciprocity. You kept, I will keep. You remained under pressure and did not yield. I will keep you from the greater pressure that is coming. It is not salvation by works. It is not the idea that you earned the rapture with sufficiently good behavior. It is something more subtle, more beautiful, more deeply biblical than that. It is the principle of sowing and reaping operating on an eschatological scale. It is the promise that faithfulness has a divine echo, that every moment of pressure absorbed without denying the name is being recorded by him who has the key of David, that the story of every person who persevered with little strength in a world that tried to make them give up will culminate in a departure that no other force in the universe can block. The door is open. No man can shut it. This is the verse that remained in silence, not out of malice, not out of theological conspiracy, out of distraction, out of the human tendency to run to the horsemen and the dragons and the numbers and the spectacular visions, and ignore the letters that were written for ordinary people living in small cities on volcanic earth, trying not to deny the name of Christ while the world trembled around them. The text was waiting. It was waiting for someone to have the patience, the hupomone, to sit with it. What this means for today. There is a moment when all theological discussion must stop talking about the past and start talking to the present. Not about what Darby thought in 1833, not about what Schofield wrote in 1909, not about what LaHaye and Jenkins imagined in the 90s, about now, about you. Revelation was written nearly 2,000 years ago. The doctrine of the rapture was systematized nearly 200 years ago. Hundreds of generations of Christians lived and died without seeing the rapture happen, and each of those generations faced the same tension that the community of Philadelphia faced, living with little strength in a world that does not stop pressuring, trying to keep the word and not deny the name while the earth trembles around them. None of that has changed. The world still trembles, the pressure still arrives, the structures still crack, and the community of believers that perseveres with little strength in peripheral neighborhoods, in dysfunctional families, in hostile work environments, in contexts of active religious persecution. This community is still the exact target of the promise of Revelation 3, verse 10. If you are in a moment of little strength, if life has pressured you in ways that seemed capable of breaking you, if keeping the faith has cost something concrete, if not denying the name has brought consequences you did not ask for, then this verse was written for your situation, not for an abstract community of the first century, for you. The hour of temptation will arrive, but the promise for those who keep the word with little strength is that it will arrive after the departure. The tribulation comes, but the bride will no longer be where the judgment will land. This is the true reason for the rapture. Not punishment for those who stay, not flight for those who go. Divine reciprocity, faithfulness, meeting faithfulness. The hupomone, you kept meeting the harpazo God prepared. An encounter that is scheduled, an event that is sealed, a door that is open, and no man can shut it. The rapture was never a plan B. It was never an emergency exit created in haste for a world that went wrong. It was the final destination of a story that began in the Garden of Eden and always walked toward a reunion. The verse that was ignored for centuries does not reveal a flaw in theology. It reveals a depth that theology is still trying to reach. God does not erase verses. He waits for you to be ready to read them. And now you are.